All right. This is also new information that I find absolutely fascinating. So we'll go through these fairly quickly, and you can find these PowerPoints on my website if you want to go back and review them or share them with somebody else. So stress is just living. People who say to me, man, I wish I could get the stress out of my life. I go, maybe not. Absence of stress is death. If you cannot respond to change, which really is what stress is all about, you're asking your brain and body to do something different. If you can't do that, you're history. 3 main categories, just so if I mention them, we'll be on the same page. Eustress is positive stress. It helps you grow. Every time I do a presentation, I'm under eustress. But I actually learn the information even better because I just hear myself saying it, so it's positive. Distress is negative. You would avoid it if you possibly could. I'd have been glad to avoid the earthquake in Napa 2014. Didn't do any damage to my house structurally, but it trashed almost everything in it. And that's something I could have done without. On the other hand, my house looks really good now because it's not cluttered at all. And mistress is hidden stress. Notice how it's spelled. First time I did this, I didn't draw that to anyone's attention, and I said hidden stress can be as damaging as negative stress. Lady put her hand up and says, Dr. Taylor, I know, my husband's had 3 of them. I said, that would be distress. So unmanaged distress and mistress literally can kill brain cells. That they start killing them usually in that mammalian layer, that second layer in the hippocampus, which is your search engine, your brain search engine, just like a search engine on the internet. And when they're gone, they're gone. There's some research that you might be able to regrow some, but that's spotty, and we're not talking about a lot. So hang on to what you have. You know, the neurons you have right now are the same ones, in all likelihood, that you had when you came out the chute. And so that's the reason it's so important to take care of those neurons, because you cannot replace them. They do not divide and multiply like other cells. And especially young people don't seem to understand that. So they take all these crazy drugs that do all kinds of things to the brain, and then they wonder later on in life when they start having memory problems and so on, I wonder what's wrong with my brain. Your choices are what's wrong with your brain. Every brain is unique. I keep harping on this because if you would get this, you would stop wasting any time or energy wanting another brain to think like yours, because it's not going to happen anyway. Every single brain is different. Every thought you think changes your software. Therefore, we actually get more different as we get older. Stress reactions, and you can put stressed brains in PET scan cameras, and they'll be subjected to the same stressor. But look, this one, yeah, well, it's not wonderful, but this one's hanging off the chandelier. Same event, 2 different brains responding very differently. Our stress reactions are typically learned in childhood by watching the big people in our lives, so it's really important how you role model and how you saw the adults in your family growing up handle stress, because we tend to do one of 2 things. We do exactly what our parents did, or we do 180 degrees different. And if what your parents did was dysfunctional, then 180 degrees different is still dysfunctional. It's just a different kind of dysfunction. So you don't want to do the opposite. You want to get healthier if you need to do that. Primarily, it relates to perception and flexibility. How bad is this, and how easily can my brain find ways to solve this? You can have stress triggered by anything. And if you don't have good stress responses, You learned the first ones you had anyway, so you are able to relearn or learn to start with healthier responses. Having said that, research shows that in general, males and females find some stressors worse than others. Interestingly enough, the top issues that stress the male brain are work issues, unemployment, being fired, bankruptcy, and separation and divorce is actually harder on the male brain. Women who perceive that they got the short end of the financial deal in a divorce may think it's really easier for the male, but it isn't. Emotionally, it is much harder on them. Because large sample studies show that the average female in the United States has at least 8 other female brains that brain can call up and talk to anytime it wants to talk about the stressor. The average male, if he's married, has 1, his spouse. And if he's having trouble with his spouse, he's lost that. So that's one reason males need to have a support group, some couple guys that you can, go bike riding with and talk to if you want to. Because separation and divorce, if he's had one support person, that's his spouse, and now she's gone, he has nobody but his attorney. For females, the most stressful thing is conflict. Female brain does not like conflict. It's important to learn that you can deal with it if you have to, but they don't like it. Serious illness, separation and death within their proximal social network. It isn't that divorce is something they like, but it actually doesn't hit them like it does the male brain. But if their best friend gets killed, that can be absolutely devastating and stressful for a female. All brains need effective stress management techniques because life is somewhat stressful. Studies now have shown that the brain responds differently to stressors depending on whether the brain is male or female. And here's the bottom line, men. Male brains struggle less with stress in the present moment, but they're much more likely to have a stress-related depressive disorder later in life. Women tend to struggle more with stress right now and are actually twice as vulnerable to stress-related disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. But they don't have this dramatically increased tendency to have a major depressive disorder later in life. The brain's the first body system to recognize a stressor, no surprise. It can stimulate a stress response for up to 72 hours after one stress event. And the stress event can be real or it can be imaginary in a person's mind. And if you keep rehearsing this Broadway performance to anybody who will listen, you keep that stress response going. And I've met people that I think have probably been in the stress response for 20 years. And it's a wonder they're still alive, because unmanaged stress is very difficult on the immune system. Here's the drawing of the 3 brain layers. So let me walk you through what we think happens in terms of chemical releases in the brain and body. So the brain recognizes the stressor. It's the first one consciously to recognize that. The hypothalamus is here in the mammalian brain layer. It's supposed to be pointing about there. And as soon as the brain recognizes the stressor, this hypothalamus begins to pour out something called Corticotropin-Releasing Factor, or CRF. What I want you to understand about this is how powerful it is. It is both a neurotransmitter and a peptide hormone. When I say that, do you have a picture in your head of what I mean? Up and down means yes. Okay. Well, quickly, you know what a neurotransmitter is? It's a substance. You know, the neurons don't touch each other. There'll be the axon of one and the dendrite of another, and you've got a space between the two of them called the synapse. Good. A neurotransmitter is a substance, a chemical, that helps get the information across that gap. And then skin divers, if you want to use that metaphor, pick it up and take it back so it's ready for the next time you want to think. So a substance that's a neurotransmitter is going to hit every neuron in your brain and body. And you have approximately 86 million neurons in your brain, another 15 billion in your brain stem, and then you've got 40,000 in your heart, and probably as many neurons in your gastrointestinal system as in your brain. So neurons are throughout your body. So anything that's a neurotransmitter is going to communicate with every single neuron in your brain and body. But it's also a peptide hormone. Give me an example of a hormone. Testosterone, cortisol, estrogen, insulin, etc. All right. A hormone, just a teeny nano drop, will impact every other cell in your body that's not a neuron. So when you have, and a peptide hormone is a hormone that impacts mood, how you think and feel at any given moment. So this CRF, when it gets triggered by the hypothalamus, is going to impact every cell in your brain and body. It's that powerful. As soon as it's released, it goes right down here to that first layer. There is something called an alarm center, the locus ceruleus, and it goes, all right, brain recognizes the stressor, it alerts the hypothalamus that pours out CRF that goes down to the alarm center, and now everything gets wired. This CRF is telegraphed through the entire brain and body by another substance called norepinephrine, which is also a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So this stress response when it hits is just mega. The news flash carried by norepinephrine creates what we call emotional arousal in the brain, meaning that it goes on super alert. That can be really helpful if it's a bona fide danger, but if it becomes chronic, or you trigger this over and over again, or you didn't need to trigger it at all, then it's lethal. And runaway CRF is a core feature of depression. So people who are continually triggering the stress response, or it gets triggered for some reason, like people coming back from the war with PTSD, can lead to depression because the CRF is continually being secreted. I brought a few examples of how powerful this is because it's being looked at in many different ways for many different reasons. For example, CRF can suppress appetite, so researchers are looking at it in relation to anorexia nervosa. Because the brain's number one goal is to stay alive. And to stay alive, you have to eat. So now we've got these brains that aren't eating. And we've tried to blame it on the fact that, parents were, whatever. But we think now that for some reason that brain is very stressed, whether or not that's been identified, pouring out CRF, now they're developing anorexia nervosa and not eating. And it's not because they're just saying, I don't think I want to eat food anymore. CRF is there that depresses appetite. It increases anxiety in the person, which further can lead to depression. It's linked with euphoric feelings that accompany alcoholism. I mean, we didn't know this before. Alcohol is a pure poison to the brain. The moment the brain recognizes that alcohol is in the body, it treats it like a toxin. It pours out CRF. And one of the things that CRF does is, oh, this is really horrible. Okay, we're going to try to make you feel a little better right now. And so they will get a few seconds to a few moments of euphoria, feel wonderful. The problem is there's not a brain on the planet that knows when that euphoric period is over, and now you start getting all the other complications from alcohol. But that's going to mean that we're going to deal with alcohol recovery differently. Because if not much is going on in the person's life and all they have is this little brief euphoria, no wonder they keep going back to that, not realizing what's going to happen down the line. It triggers inflammation. That's now being looked at with both multiple sclerosis and forms of arthritis. And, hello, high levels have been found in the cerebral spinal fluid of individuals who had major depression and in those who committed suicide. So now we're looking at suicide in an entirely different way. It is an altered brain. Remember, the brain's number one goal is what? To stay alive. But if the brain gets seriously altered with CRF, norepinephrine, cortisol, you name it, the brain loses its goal of staying alive. And the part of the prefrontal cortex where you have inhibition, or the part that says, oh, you just got this impulse to kill yourself, wait a minute, we're not going there. That part stops working. So we believe that people only commit suicide if their brain is in an altered state. Can you learn to control CRF? No, but you can learn to control your response to stress, because it's the stress that pours out the CRF. So I suppose you could say you learn to control that, but you really learn to control your perception so that you don't kick into the stress response. Rats make wonderful research subjects when you can't use people. For several reasons, and I'm always being asked, how come you use rats for research, and how does that translate to the human brain? Well, under a microscope, it's almost impossible to differentiate whether you're looking at a rat neuron or a human neuron. They're that much the same, number one, and number two, they use the same peptides. So if you get good research in rats, probably you can apply it at some level to human beings. And rats can be trained to do all kinds of cognitive tasks better than some people. You can put them in a complex maze, and within a day or two, they got it mastered. You put a human being in a walk-through maze, and 5 years later, they haven't found their way out. I mean, they're really amazing little creatures, learn very quickly. So researchers wanted to study stress because we're getting all of these people back from the wars with post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, approximately 20% of active military are going to come back with PTSD. So what's going on in those brains? And of the two, male or female, it can be much more difficult for a woman to recover from PTSD than a male. So the way they did this, they took a bunch of female rats and a bunch of male rats, and they got a bunch of wine barrels, and they fill them up with water so that the rat can't touch the ground and keep his or her nose above the water line, but it's too low to climb out. Now they drop these little rats, and they're amazing. They can swim for at least 48 hours. Just swimming, swimming, swimming. I'd hate to see one of us swimming for 48 hours. And when their little noses started going under, they'd fish them out. And just like the way the male and the female brain is wired is staggeringly different, the way male and female rats respond to stress is staggeringly different. Here is a drawing of one neuron down there in the brainstem. Remember the locus coeruleus, where CRF goes and then triggers norepinephrine and so on. This is one neuron from the rat brain, female rat brain. These blue things are called receptor molecules. You know, if that's a hard term for you, do a metaphor. This is my metaphor. This neuron has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, has 7 large windows. When CRF is released and floods around the neurons, this female rat neuron has 7 wide open windows. And so all of the CRF that arrives floods into the cell. This increased CRF binding, if you want to go read the research, it's called CRF binding, meaning it's a way for the CRF to get into the cell, heightens the brain's stress reactivity. Bottom line, women, we consistently overreact to stressors because our brain takes all the CRF in and it makes us more reactive. See these little green things? Those are proteins. They're called arrestins. In the female brain, they're doing nothing but looking pretty. Don't know why they've stopped working. This is a drawing of a male rat brain, stressed. Notice, these little green things are getting busy and doing something. What they're doing is slamming the window shut and pulling it inside the cell. So this one's in, this one's coming in, that's on their way in, and in the research, usually about half of those receptor molecules were deactivated, so that brain could only take in half as much CRF. And because of that, the male brain has toned down neuron sensitivities. So gentlemen, bottom line, you underreact. You don't think it's nearly as bad as it is. You know, she's hanging off the chandelier, you're going, what's the problem? Doesn't seem like much of a problem to me. Which is a really helpful thing when a couple's trying to resolve something. So there you see them side by side. You know, windows are all open, arrestins doing nothing. They are arrested themselves. And so all the CRF pours into that cell and makes it really reactive. The arrestins are pulling in the windows, slamming them shut, so that only takes half as much of the CRF. And you can go to my website and you can get the research and look it up, as long as you remember that in the research, these little windows are receptors. And the binding means that the substance is able to get through into the cell. So you can read the research. Deborah Van Gasser, who is a wonderful researcher, says, the female alarm system, up here in the brainstem, is more sensitive to stressors and to CRF, period. Even in the absence of stressors, the female stress signaling system is more sensitive from the start. So lack of receptor internalization, okay, now you know how to read the research. Lack of the fact that these receptors are not pulled into the cell could translate into impaired ability to cope with high levels of CRF, and we clearly see that in depression and PTSD. So in the female brain, it makes the stressor seem way worse in the present moment. The male brain, increased receptor internalization, they're pulling in the windows, makes the stressor seem less intense, and it's no big deal. I can't understand the reason you're upset. You know, it'll pass. However, what we're now seeing is the male brain, who's underestimated stress in the moment, is at much higher risk for a major depressive event in 25 years. And researchers think it's maybe because the less intense stress response in the moment means that you haven't really dealt with it, you've just stuffed it, and so you're developing this slush fund of unresolved stress that down the line something will happen and all of that unresolved stress hits you and you totally fall apart, have a major stress event, want to kill yourself, whatever, because your brain's so altered. University of Michigan wanted to look at this based on race and gender. They wanted to compare stressful life events and the risk of a major depressive episode, 25 years. Data broken out by gender and race. So the first thing they found was there was no difference for a risk of a major depressive event based on race for females. And the first group were only looking at white females and black females. So it didn't matter, white or black. Don't have any increased risk for this major depressive episode in 25 years. They did large sample interviews and questionnaires, and they think that that's because women tend to use more coping strategies than males do. And I mentioned one of those earlier. Women tend to have 8 people on average that they can call up and talk about this stressor to. You know, males aren't even talking that much. 12 to 13,000 words a day, most used at work. Average woman speaking somewhere from 60 to 80,000 words a day. And that's if she doesn't speak in public. I mean, that's a huge difference. They tend to be more aligned with spirituality or religion. 2/3 of the congregations in any denomination you want to survey in the United States are women. There's 1/3 or less of males, and for some women that can give them a whole lot of comfort, and they have more emotional expression. Remember, they'll talk about it immediately, whereas males tend not to. It's not good or bad, it's just different. Now they looked at males, and here you poor pathetic white guys better listen up. Researchers found a much stronger predictive role of stressful life events and the risk of a major depressive order for white males than black males 25 years later. Despite higher levels of exposure to stressful life events, you know, large sample studies say that in the average environment in the Western world, you know, it can be more stressful for a black male, harder to get a job, they have to do better to, you know, be recognized and so on and so forth. Disproportionately, they have lower rates of depression. And when they did large sample studies, it looked like the black males had a higher tendency to implement coping strategies compared to the white guys. You know, they'll get together and they'll jam on their musical instruments, and they have big black male convocations where they, you know, talk about issues. They're better at positive reappraisal. They do better at maintaining hope and optimism. So it's really the white male who they're finding is at serious risk for a major depressive event 25 years after this very stressful event. My folks tell me about the Depression in Canada, and no, I wasn't alive then. And the banks failed, and you know, all of that stuff. Okay, first of all, there was no women, none, who climbed up at the top of the building and jumped off and killed themselves. And there were some fairly wealthy women. There were no black males that climbed up and jumped off. But these white-collar males were killing themselves, you know, like you'd swat flies at a picnic. So I think we need to take a look at that. The brain stress equation. Stressors interact with the brain in a predictable equation. Here's the formula. Only 20% of any negative impact to your brain and body is due to the stressor. If you'll have 100 people, they'll all be subjected to the same stressor. Everybody will have some bodily reaction to the stressor, but only 20% of it is due to the actual event. 80% is due to your perception of the event and the weight you give to it. So I can't do everything about a stressful event. I can try to avoid them if at all possible, but if I can't, I'm going to have 20% negative impact to my body from the stressor. But 80% is going to be what I think about it and how important it is and, you know, the weight I give to it. I can do absolutely everything about that because I create my own perception. I create my own evaluation of what this means. So when Paul says in Philippians, be anxious for nothing, I think he's talking about the 80%. Because we can't prevent everything. But if you refuse to be anxious, implement your strategies, access your support service, support group, so on and so forth, you can handle 80% of it. And that's huge. And as I'm learning to do that, I really don't feel too stressed most of the time. Epictetus. I went to Greece. Learned about Epictetus. First time I talked about that, said I was back from Greece. Somebody in the audience said, did you get to meet him? So ever since then, I have been careful to put 2nd century in there. Because I just had Greek philosopher before that. Well, did you get to meet him while you were there? Oh, yeah, right. He was a slave. Evidently, he was a valued slave because when he didn't want to be a slave and ran away and his master caught him, he busted up his leg so bad that he never could walk again. He was always on a crutch. And I don't know what happened. I haven't found that part of the story. If you look him up in Wikipedia, you'll see a picture of him sitting at a desk and his badly misformed leg in his crutch. Eventually, somehow, he was freed. And he became this philosopher. And he said some amazing things. He was the one who said, it's not so much what happens that matters as what you think about what happens. And now that has become what we call the 20-80 rule. Going to have some impact from a negative event. But 80% of it is what you think about it, how you keep rehearsing it. Was talking about stress in another country, and this lady came up to talk to me, and she said, could I just have 2 minutes with you? And I said, okay. So she started telling me about the horrible things that had happened to her. And I'm telling you, they were pretty horrible. I really didn't want to hear them. But I was gracious for about 5 minutes. And then I said, because she's sobbing and crying and she can hardly talk. And I said, when did this happen to you? And I'm thinking, yesterday. She goes, 37 years ago. Okay, she's been triggering the stress response for 37 years. And it's no wonder that her immune system is failing. Because we are told to be anxious for nothing. And I remember back to the stories that I used to hear when I was a preacher's kid, like Paul and Silas are in prison. And if you've ever been to the Holy Land, let me tell you, the prisons there are ugly. And they're in stocks sitting on this cold cement floor, don't know what's going to happen to them. And what are Paul and Silas doing? Singing. What kind of songs are they singing? Praise songs. Because gratitude is the antidote to fear. And the moment you feel fearful and stressed, think of something to be grateful for, because it is the antidote to stress. And it's just amazing how that works. So my recommendation is that we need to each one be living the 80-20 rule, or the 20-80 rule, whatever way you want to call it. Even when you can't do anything about the 20%, you can do almost everything about the 80%, because your brain creates your own perceptions. That's why you can have 100 people, and you can have the same event, and you get 100 different perceptions. And some people are screaming and crying and saying, this is the end of the world, it's so horrible. And some are saying, well, it wasn't wonderful, but I'm not going to spend any energy on that. And then you got everybody in between. And we choose that response. Shelley Taylor is a researcher. She is the researcher that identified the stress response called tend, befriend. Have you heard of that stress response? Okay, we all know about fight, flight. We pretty much know about conserve, withdraw, although you might not have thought of it in that terminology, but that simply means that when something really horrible happens, the brain sort of sometimes takes a deep breath and steps back and just becomes immobile for a while. Spouse has the other spouse suddenly, unexpectedly killed, and their whole life changes for 2 or 3 months. They're in conserve withdrawal. They don't want to go out and talk to anybody. They want to do anything. They just sit there hibernating. It's a way of the body and brain saying, just give me a moment here. Let's breathe. Let's try to process this. And then hopefully they get right back to living. If you don't, then you're stuck in conserve withdrawal, and that's not attractive. But there's a third one, stress response, called tend, befriend. I wish I could say I was related to her, because I think the woman's brilliant. She's been doing research on women who are abused, not that men aren't, but women who are abused and how they respond to that abuse. Because we've known for years, if a woman is being battered, mentally, emotionally, physically, sometimes she's battered so badly she's got broken bones and bruises all over her, and they take her out of the home, put her in a safe house, and 3 or 4 months later she's healed. And then they discharged her, and where did she go? Right back to the place where she was abused. Hello? Because there is a stress response called tend, befriend. And if women are not helped to understand that that particular stress response, probably not the one you want to implement here, they will just go right back and say, well, I must have done something. It's probably my fault. I'm going to go back and I'm going to get it right this time. I'm going to try harder. And all she has done is increase her risk dramatically for being killed. So that's what Shelley Taylor's noted for. The other thing is that she says when you perceive a stressor, think about this 20-80 rule. And everybody has had at least one, as she calls it, gold medal moment. And she talks about the Olympics. She says every one of us has had something just wonderful happen to us. So a stressor pops up, you've got some response, now you're trying to deal with the 80%. She says, remember your gold medal moment and focus on that. And say, I might not be experiencing that right this minute. I am going to remember what it felt like, and I know I'll have some more. And that helps manage that 80%. So here's the bottom line. Major stressor. Men are walking around saying, I don't think it's that bad. Women are hanging off the chandelier. Recognize your own tendency. Every woman may not be like this, and every male may not be like this, but this is at least bell curve research. So what's your tendency? Is your tendency to underreact or overreact? Once you know that, whatever you do, stop making any disparaging remarks to the other person because they're having a different stress response. Just understand what's happening. Then collaborate to find the middle ground, because it's worse than you guys think, but it's not as bad as you women think. So you want to find the middle. And you can help each other do that. And I've watched husbands and wives, girlfriends and boyfriends learn to do this, and it's really beautiful. So a couple are in my office, and steam is coming out her ears. And he's there rolling his eyes, looking out the window, hands in his pockets. I said to her, what can I do for you? She goes, he wants to move his mother in with us. And she is just awful. She has never liked me. If she moves in with us, I'm gone. I can't do this. So she goes on and on like this for about 5 minutes. And finally I said, okay, I got the picture. So he's still looking out the window. I said, Tim, talk to me about your mother. I did not say to him, look at me when I'm talking to you. Men don't want to look at you when they're talking to you. They don't want to do that from the day they're 3 days old. If you watch two men talking to each other, are they standing looking right at each other the whole time like women do? No, you'd think there was something wrong with them. One of them's looking out this window, one of them's looking out that window. They look at each other periodically, and yet we tell boys and men, look at me when I'm talking to you, stop it. It's very stressful for them. So I said to him, tell me about your mother. He's talking to the window, and he says, well, she's not the easiest person in the world to get along with, I will give you that, but how long do you think she's going to live? I says, I don't know, but long enough to ruin your marriage, perhaps. How old is she? 63. I said, that's the new 43. Kiss your marriage goodbye. So I say to her, what's the reason you want, that he wants, I said to him, what's the reason that you want her to move in with you? Well, it'd be cheaper than helping her pay for an apartment. And his wife says, it's not going to be cheaper than a divorce. So I sat them down, and I explained this to them. I said, ask your wife, what's the two worst things that she thinks that moving her in would cause? He says, well, I can probably guess what she'd say. I said, ask her. You can't read her mind. And he was surprised at the two things that she said, and they weren't what he was thinking about. And then I said, all right, can you work with her to deal with those two things and decide if it's worth it? Is it worth it? Because what you've described to me is a woman who is very unhappy for whatever reason and causes stress everywhere she goes, including the petrol station. And they eventually came to the conclusion that they would rather put the money out to buy her, rent her, whatever, an apartment than move her in to their home. And I honored that. But I'll tell you, if they hadn't gotten this together, trust me, she'd have moved in and the wife had moved out. And who is divorce harder on? The man. Now he's left with his mother that he left home with when he was 13 because she was such a problem. He just sort of distanced himself from her and hadn't paid that much attention. So collaborate, find the middle ground, watch what each gender does well. Because if you guys underestimate it and it's a lot worse than you think, then you're going to pay a price down the line. But women, if you way overestimate it, you're going to stress yourself by your overestimation more than you're going to stress yourself by the stressor. So talk about it. Find the middle of the road. Help each other. And I just laugh about it. I just laugh about it. Periodically, I'm working with somebody at, one of the places I'm speaking or the office, and, I'm thinking this is going to be really bad. And I know this. I'm thinking, okay, it can't be that bad, but it's almost. And the CEO is going, I don't think it's going to be a problem. Well, he's looking at that a little bit differently now because 6 months ago there was something that came up and I told them, this is a huge problem. You need to deal with it now. Oh, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. Well, it was worse than I thought it was. So now they're getting a little better at collaborating. So, increased knowledge will not get rid of the situation. It's not going to get rid of the male-female differences, in spite of one guy who says, if I really learn this stuff, will they go away? I said, only if you get divorced and never talk to a woman again in your life. But it can actually be fun to negotiate this if you keep that uppermost. So let's finish by just a few little tips for how you reduce stress. And thank you for hanging out with me this afternoon. It's been fun for me. All right, here we go. Tips for coping with stressors. Drive carefully, especially when you are coping with stressors. It's not only cars that can be recalled by their maker. Be careful what you say during episodes of high stress. If you can't be kind, be silent, or at least have the decency to be vague. Never put both feet in your mouth at the same time, or you won't have a leg to stand on. Birthdays are very good for you. The more you have, the longer you live, so learn to enjoy them. Stop the mad competitive rush. It's the second mouse who gets the cheese. Learn from crayons. Some are sharp, some are pretty, some are dull, some have weird names, and all are different colors, but they all have to live in the same box. Sleep late whenever possible. It's the early worm that gets eaten by the bird. Except that some days you're the pigeon, and some days you're the statue. Practice laughter on the days that you're the statue. The truly happy and typically low-stress personality is the one who can actually enjoy the scenery on a detour. Thank you.